All right, channel members, we have an update on the migration figures in the US housing market, the cities that the most people are moving to and the cities that they're leaving. This is data that you need to understand fresh off the presses from the US Census Bureau. So let's get into it. The first thing you need to understand about the migration trends in 2022 is that once again, the South crushed it. You can see they did 888,000 people in 2021 moving into the South. Well, they did 1.3 million in 2022. And I have to eat a little crow on this, everyone, because I thought that the migration into the South would have peaked here during the first year after the pandemic. It kept going again last year. And this migration into the South came at the expense of pretty much every other region. The West Coast in America was basically flat on migration, which is bad because historically it was always very positive on migration. The Midwest lost about 30,000 people, which is pretty typical. And then the Northeast lost 246,000 people, which is actually the worst showing for the Northeast in the last 30 years, according to the Census Bureau data. And then looking at the situation here on a map can provide further clarity. The yellow area is the area defined as the South, the green is the Northeast, orange is the Midwest, the blue is the West Coast. And what you can see actually in the places that lost people like the West Coast, you can see there's one big state like California was really the big loser on the West Coast that dragged everywhere else down. Illinois was the big loser in the Midwest that dragged everyone else down, and then New York was the big loser in the Northeast that dragged everyone else down. Now, further into this video, I'm going to show you the top 10 cities that Americans moved to in 2022, because that's very interesting data for you to know as a home buyer and investor. But before that, I actually want to ask a question that might seem like a dumb question at first. And the question is this: does this migration data actually matter for the US housing market? And the initial response is, of course it matters, because the more people moving in, the more home buyers there would be, and the lower the inventory, and the more the prices would go up. But funny enough, folks, when you look at the data, you get some different conclusions about what this migration shift really means. The first graph we're looking at here is comparing the migration in 2022 for all the different counties in America to how much inventory has increased, for sale inventory has increased on these housing markets over the last 12 months into early 2023. And what do you notice? There's a strong positive correlation that the more that people moved into a county in 2022, the more that inventory for sale on the market has gone up over the last year, which is kind of counterintuitive. Like you can see these areas in Texas and Tennessee and Georgia that had a lot of people move in. Well, they have a lot more inventory for sale now. Whereas these areas in the bottom left, like in Westchester County, New Jersey, had people move out, the inventory is down still year over year. Like, why is that the case? Why are higher migration numbers not showing up in inventory? Why is it the exact opposite situation where the highest migration counties have the most homes for sale? And a lot of that has to do with home building, everyone. Home building, a topic I'm going to address in a second. But another thing that's important to understand if you're a home buyer or investor looking at these migration figures, which you can look at on ReVenture app, is to understand the home price trends. Like, what does migration mean for home prices in the long run in the US housing market? You can see on this graph, we're comparing, once again, all the large counties in America on the basis of their migration over the last 22 years, from 2000 to 2022, compared to their home value growth over the last 22 years. And what do you notice? There's a slight positive relationship, meaning that the more migration, the higher the prices, but the relationship is very weak, an R-squared of 0.06. So what this says is that, low or negative migration areas like, let's say, Philadelphia County over the last 20 years have done just as good in terms of appreciation as positive migration areas like Williamson County and Nashville. And so there's really not much of a long-term correlation between migration and home price growth. And why? Well, again, it comes back to home building, everyone. Builders are not ignorant of the migration trends in America, and typically they build and adapt to the level of people that are moving into a city. So if you're a buyer and investor who wants to understand what migration means for home prices in your housing market in the future, you got to look at it in conjunction with home building and home building permits, which is what we're doing here on this graph. We're comparing the migration, the blue line, to the building permits, the orange line, in Austin, Texas over the last 30 years. And what do you notice, folks, is that they're very related. Like when migration goes up, building goes up. When migration goes down, building goes down. You can see in a market like Austin too, in a lot of different cities in the South, like these have always been high migration markets. Like people moving to Austin is nothing new. They were doing that in '06. They were doing that in '01. But really, it's the relationship between the blue line, the migration, and the orange line, the permits, that matters the most. And that's what these bars show, kind of the surplus of migration to permits. And what do you notice in Austin? Well, the average surplus is 12,000 more people than permits built each year, which is not much of a surplus at all when you consider it's typically 2 migrants per 1 housing unit. And what you notice is that in the last 5 years, the surplus has turned into a deficit in certain years, or it's gone down significantly, which indicates overbuilding. And so despite the fact that Austin was still a top 10 migration market in 2022, its housing market is crashing. Prices are down by 15%. Inventory has quadrupled on the market in Austin in spite of this migration. And you would have known this if you're a home buyer and investor if you also tracked the building permits. And so I would encourage you guys to do that if you want to delve into this data further on ReVenture app. You can open up the app here and then go to demographic variables and then go to migration. You'll see the migration trends in all these different housing markets. And if you open one of them up, you can then see those migration trends over the last 30 years. And in addition, pay attention, is the migration today higher substantially than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? If the answer is no, then your market isn't really benefiting from migration, so to speak. It's more normal. But we have certain cities in America where the migration has spiked way above normal. And this is an explanation of why certain housing markets have really boomed a lot in America over the last couple of years. One example would be Tampa. If we go to ReVenture app on the graph section and look at Tampa, St. Petersburg migration total, we can see, wow, 68,000 net people moved in 2022. That's an all-time high in Tampa, which helps explain why the Tampa housing market boomed over the last couple of years with these people moving in. But one thing I'm a little concerned with in Tampa is what I call the migration cliff, which you can see the migration cliff that occurred in the mid-2000s. Like in '05, migration in Tampa went up to a similar amount. It was actually higher in percentage terms back then than it was today. But then look at this. Bam! The migration plummeted in a migration cliff that occurred during the last housing crash and last recession. And so, to me, if you live in a city where the migration has surged in the last year or two, way above normal levels, that actually makes me concerned. Because it says to me that the housing market was destabilized, the prices went up more than locals can afford, and I suspect there's going to be a migration cliff and a migration fall off in a lot of these excessively high migration markets. One city in particular that's already experiencing this is Boise, Idaho. You can see Boise had a migration surge in 2021 up to 26,000 people, highest level of all time, but then look what happened in 22. Boom, it went down to 12,000 people. So still people were moving to Boise, but that was actually the lowest level in 7 years. And I suspect, as the California tech recession gets worse and remote workers keep getting called back in the office, this migration in Boise is probably going to keep going down, similar to how it went down in the late 2000s, which is going to be a problem for the Boise housing market structurally because people just can't afford the prices locally. And so when the migration dips, you're going to have just extended issues in the housing market. And personally, what I would do if I were a real estate investor or a home buyer looking for the right city to move to, I would pick an area with more moderate levels of migration, like an area that's consistently adding people, but not crazy, that's also still affordable. Because that type of place is going to do much better during this housing downturn. And in particular, you can use ReVenture app to do this, everyone. Take a look at this. First thing I'm going to do is say, let's limit the list to cities with at least 150,000 people, just so we are sure that there's at least some people that live there. All right, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do an additional filter. I'm going to do migration as percentage of population, and we're going to do 0 to 2%. And so this gives us metros, which added people last year, but it didn't add so many people. And then next, what we're going to do finally is restrict this list to areas where the house payment as a percentage of median income is less than 30%. And so the remaining list is larger metro areas that have positive migration that are still affordable for local home buyers. And these are going to be places that are going to do better during this downturn. And if you hit table view here on the top right, you can actually get a list of these areas and sort them by all types of metrics like inventory growth or price cuts or population or household income. Oh, and finally, folks, let's look at the top 10 cities that the most people moved to in 2022, because I know you guys want to see that. All right, so this is the list in nominal terms. Dallas actually added the most people. DFW added 130,000 people in 2022. Houston was number 2. Tampa was number 3. Phoenix was number 4. Atlanta number 5. Orlando, Austin, San Antonio, Charlotte, and Northport. So we have 4 places in Texas, 3 in Florida, 1 in Arizona, 1 in Georgia, 1 in North Carolina. And these housing markets have performed kind of like a mixed bag over the last year. Dallas, the inventory is up 200%, prices are down 5%. Phoenix, the inventory is way up, prices are down 10%. Austin, the inventory is way up, prices are down 15%. But markets like Charlotte and Orlando have actually held strong. And so, once again, migration data on its own is not enough for you as an investor or a home buyer to understand the health of your housing market. You got to use it in conjunction with looking at home building and also looking at income and affordability levels as well. The income and affordability is still super important today. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. I plan on doing more of these deep dives on ReVenture app, and over the next month I'm going to roll out a membership platform on ReVenture app so you guys can get access to this on a more consistent basis. And one last thing, everyone, I would encourage you guys to read the blog post I did on ReVenture app associated with this article. It has even more in-depth analysis if you want to understand these figures at an even higher level, especially some specifics about when the migration data was taken from the US Census Bureau and some additional data and graphs. So read the blog post. There's a hyperlink in the comments section here below.